Hello and welcome to the Pod of the Damned. I'm your host, Ian. Joining me this week as we make our big return is my co-host, Anna. How's it going?
Very good. How are you?
Glad to be back.
Yes.
Glad to be back. We're obviously back. We've taken a few weeks off in the last few weeks, mostly down to work, to be honest with you, that we've not been able to make any recordings. Nico is still otherwise engaged. He's been working really hard, so he's been unable to make the last few recordings. I've not been able to do anything for the last couple of weeks, so me and Anna, we're coming to make our big return. We're hopefully going to get quite a few things recorded and done over the course of the next week or so that we don't have to go through another 3-week period, because that's now 2 years in a row. For being a horror podcast, that is now 2 years in a row that we've actually missed Halloween completely. We completely missed it last year as well. Before we go any further, Boomer, thank you so much for that resub. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here as well. But anyways, if you're new here, if you're listening to this on the download, you haven't listened to us before, or if you've just forgotten because we've been away for a few weeks, we are a horror podcast that deep dives into a different topic every single week in our quest to create a leaderboard of the best and worst horror movies of all time. This is episode number 92. And in today's show, we're talking all about the brand new release, Five Nights at Freddy's. This is, you're like our new release person now, because you were on for our Saw 10 episode as well. So Anna's just like our new release host now. You just come on when we're doing new release. Before we get there though, do a little bit of housekeeping. If you'd like to support us across our social media platforms, you can do so. We're on X at Damned Podcast. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Pod of the Damned. You can email us at podofthedamned@gmail.com. And you can subscribe to us on Patreon, patreon.com/Pod of the Damned. So we have a lot of special guests coming up on the show over the next few weeks as well. Some familiar faces, some other unfamiliar faces, but people who are all friends of the show, people who you'll be familiar with. We've just been watching Harry Potter and a big character died, so she's still a bit emotional.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, a little cry. But yeah, anyways, so that's where you can find us. That's what we've got coming up in terms of people coming up in the next couple of weeks or so. We're not going to hang about today. This isn't going to be the longest episode in the world, purely for the fact that we've been out of the loop for a good few weeks. So we're trying to get back into the swing of things. In that couple of weeks, though, we did go and see Five Nights at Freddy's. So we thought we would do a little episode on it. It's good when you get like promotional bots in the chat and things like that. We'll just pretend we didn't see that. There we go. Boomer's straight on it, deleting that. Did you see that? How good was that? Thank you very much, Boomer. Gotta just say, how do you say it? FNAF. It's like, say proper way to say it. It's the only proper way to say it. It's just got to say FNAF instead of Five Nights at Freddy's. I don't know. FNAF. Anyways, shall we just get into it then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Right, let's just fire on through to the episode. We're talking all about Five Nights at Freddy's. This movie was released in 2023, was directed by Emma Tammy, and stars Josh Hutcherson, Piper Rubio, and Elizabeth Lail. The IMDb plot is as follows. A troubled security guard begins working at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It just says Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Is it? I thought it was Pizzeria. Anyway, during his first night on the job, he realizes that the night shift won't be so easy to get through. Pretty soon he will unveil what actually happened at Freddy's. Now, this is something that's only been out for the last couple of weeks. I just want to get, before we go delving into specifics about the movie and things that we maybe did like and didn't like, very quickly, brief overview. What did you think of the movie?
It's going to be a hard episode, to be honest, because a lot of people are fans of the video game.
Uh-huh.
So
games. There's about 12 of them.
See, already. But yeah, the movie I did not really enjoy it. No,
you're not a fan. Not a fan at all.
And
I have to admit, I'm also not a fan of this movie in general.
Fell asleep.
I fell asleep in the cinema for probably a pretty decent portion of the movie. So actually, Boomer just brings up a point there. I'd only played. I remember I'd streamed the first video game quite a while ago. Boomer, you might actually remember that, because I think pretty sure you were about for that happening. I did stream one of the video games, the very first one, a while ago. I think I tried to stream the second one, and then I just sort of gave up on it a little bit. I really enjoyed the video game. It was really good as a sort of jump scare kind of basic kind of game.
Yeah.
Like, there's not a lot to the game. It's a very sort of straightforward concept. Especially the first one. I know obviously as you go further and further into the franchise, they expand on the lore and there's more things that you can and can't do. So they do expand on that. But my problem is, and it's an opinion for me that that keeps sort of coming up when I'm reading what people think about it, and people keep saying, well, if you're a fan of the video games, then you're gonna be a fan of this movie, because there's tons of Easter eggs in there. There's lots of nods to like the lore that the video games have. And in my opinion, whilst that is absolutely fine to have as many references to the video games as you want. Throwing my pen. That's how angry I am. I'm literally throwing my pen out my hand. Have all your references, have your Easter eggs, get some of the lore in there, but I shouldn't need to know all of that going into what is essentially the first movie of the franchise.
Yeah.
This is the because I'm gonna go on a limb here and say that based on the success of this movie, because I know you're not familiar with just how successful this movie has actually been yet, and I'll get into it. This movie has been massively successful. I'm going to go with that the franchise is going to continue, and we're going to get more Five Nights at Freddy's movies. But given that this is the first one, I don't really feel like it's introduced me to the franchise particularly well.
No.
It's expected me to already be familiar with it. That's how I feel going into it.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know if confusing is the word, but it's just very kind of awkward. It doesn't feel like a horror movie at all. It, like, when I had to describe to someone, I said that it's more like a love story than a horror.
Oh yeah, because
it's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, listen. It's a horror movie, right? So I'm just gonna I'll disagree with you a little bit there. I think it's absolutely a horror movie. It's a very, very entry level horror movie, and I'm gonna go over that as well in a little bit. But I totally get what you mean. It just feels very muddled, doesn't it? It feels very confused about what it's trying to achieve. It doesn't have, I don't know, it just doesn't have that sort of direction that I think I wanted it to go. And I'm just going to say it, and you've watched this movie with me before as well. Willy's Wonderland did it better. Like, Willy's you remember watching that? And I just think Willy's Wonderland is a better movie. I think it did it better, to be honest.
Yeah, it definitely did.
Sorry? No, you're done? Okay. Let's just catch up with the chat a little bit. Boomer, obviously, you're saying you've never played the games going in. You want to say it came out around the time of Slenderman. There were a lot of simple jump scare games around then. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the first Five Nights at Freddy's game came out, I want to say in 2014 or 2012. I think it was one of those. It's been about a decade now, I think, and there's been a lot of games. It's not just games, it's a comic book series. It's like it as a franchise itself, it is massively successful and it's done really, really well. So fair play to it for that. And the movie itself is also done fantastically well. I just don't think for my personal taste, the movie is transferred particularly well across from video games, which, is a common drawback with a lot of video game adaptation movies. And we've talked about a couple of them on the podcast before. Not me and you, Anna, but with Nico and some other guests, when we've covered Resident Evil movies. And again, going into that whole sort of Easter egg thing, I can't remember if this is one you've seen or not, but back on the show when we did Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, that game is essentially, that movie is essentially Resident Evil 2 and 3 just spliced together as a movie. And I still felt that even if you hadn't seen those games, you could still watch that movie and find a level of enjoyment in it, because Yes, there's tons of Easter eggs. Yes, there's lore in there, but you didn't necessarily need to know that to just sort of get a pretty relative grasp of what's going on in the film. And I think, unfortunately, that was just a movie that wasn't particularly well received, which I think is a little disappointing because I actually think it's one of the better ones. I think that's a movie you'd probably like, to be honest with you, from that sort of franchise as well. But in terms of like other video game adaptations, you know, they historically don't do particularly well. So, you know, this one, again, and again, it goes back as well to what we were saying about back when Wren was on the show to talk about Terrifier. You know, he wasn't a fan of that movie, but he was a fan of how successful it was because it meant that, you know, other independent sort of horror movies would then potentially be taken more seriously, you know, and got more money, and then things like Skinamarink would come out, and some other things that would maybe not have gotten to see the light of day, maybe wouldn't have managed to get into theaters, was suddenly managing to do that. So there is, I guess, that kind of aspect when it comes to Five Nights at Freddy's. Maybe, you know, it might help sort of video game adaptations be taken a little bit more seriously. I don't know, like, I'm just sort of throwing that out there. Boomer's also agreeing that Nick Cage and Willy's Wonderland was better. Street Fighter, sorry.
I think if I hadn't seen the Willy's Wonderland first, I think I might have liked this one. I would be like more into it, maybe.
You think?
Because I was comparing this one to the other one.
You think if you'd seen Five Nights at Freddy's first and then seen Willy's Wonderland, you would have preferred Five Nights at Freddy, or just had you seen Five Nights at Freddy first, you'd just feel a bit better about this?
Yeah, probably.
Okay,
because
that's fair.
I was comparing both of them, and out of them two, this one is kind of lower.
Rudy in the chat also says, never played the games, but I thought the movie was okay. It's not some kind of epic masterpiece, but it's a fun PG-13 entry-level horror. Right, and I think, you know, that's like we're sort of dancing around that subject as well. I think it is just the point is, like, this is entry-level horror, you know, and if entry-level horror is not your thing, then, you know, you're maybe not going to enjoy this. It is PG-13 in America. Over here, that's a 15. It's a 15 rating over here, so anyone only over 15s can go and see it here. I feel like you probably, because for people who are unaware, our rating system, you have a U for Universal, you have PG, which is just parental guidance, but pretty much everyone can still go and see those. You have a 12A, which means if you're under the age of 12, you need to go with an adult, but you can still go see the movie. 15's for 15 or over, and then 18, which is essentially an R rating, is an 18. So I feel like even though this was a 15 here, probably could have gotten away with this one being a 12A.
I think so too, yeah.
I don't, there's nothing.
You don't actually see any of the kills on the screen, which was kind of, might have been missing for me, but yeah. Yeah,
again though, that's like an entry-level horror thing, isn't it? It's like...
to be fair, like, the most terrifying part was when she kind of like got snapped in half.
Oh yeah.
And then when the guy's ribs were getting broken.
Yeah, but
nothing.
But again, that's all sort of suggested. You didn't see any of it. Which, if you're having an entry-level horror movie, a horror movie maybe more aimed towards a younger audience, you're not going to have the gore factor. Listen, I've mentioned the movie already. I wasn't going into this expecting a Terrifier level of gore, but I think for me, and at my age and for my enjoyment, I would have preferred there to be a bit more sort of blood and guts and gore in this. There had been rumoured that there was a director's cut that was significantly more gory, but the director, I think, has come out and said that there is not going to be a gorier director's cut, and I'm a little disappointed by that. I feel like, you know, you could have this movie, have it be what it is for the age groups you want it to be. If that cut exists, I don't see any reason why that cut shouldn't see the light of day. And then maybe us fans who, you know, want a little bit more blood and guts and gore could maybe get access to that. Rudy also says, I let my 7 and 12-year-old watch it. They enjoyed it. Not too much blood, not too many jump scares, but the themes were there. Absolutely. You know, like, there's very, very, very little blood in this, blood and guts in this movie. The jump scare, I mean, Five Nights at Freddy's is a jump scare franchise. Once again, going back to that video games, the video games are absolutely, completely based around jump scares. That is what the
Yeah.
video games are. They are jump scare style movies. So, and that brings me on to Boomer's point you just made. You said, would more gore have actually made the film any better? Not necessarily, as I'm saying, that's not what
Yeah.
the film is based on. I think it's simply the fact,
I think if they had a bit more like jump scares or something more like scary or like terrifying.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it would maybe have just added to like the cool factor of the movie a little bit. I just kind of was going halfway through the movie, a bit sleepy, and I was just kind of sitting there thinking, it's like I just don't think it was for me. Like,
Yeah.
I wasn't enjoying it. There was very very little I was sort of clinging on to. I understand like sort of the premise again, going back to entry level, and there's tons of entry level horror movies out there that I love. And those entry level horror movies can all be at like a slightly different standard in terms of scariness, goriness, comedy, whatever sort of factors you want to put against it, because I've listed a few here and they're all very different kinds of horror movies. So things like Hocus Pocus, for example,
Yeah.
great entry level horror movie, definitely one that's aimed more towards the younger side of the audience as well, but still one that I love, still one I'm sure you really love. Things like the Addams Family, again, definitely focused more on sort of family friendly, funny, but it's definitely got those themes in there. But you can
even like the Wednesday series.
yeah, exactly, absolutely. But you can scale that all the way up, because I would still include one of your absolute favorites, Trick or Treat, as a relatively entry level horror movie. Absolutely love that movie. I think it's possibly one of the best of this type of movie that it is. But I would still say that's a movie that's maybe not for young kids, so maybe not like 7-year-olds, but maybe sort of more like early teens sort of level, that could be a horror movie for them. And then going all the way up, things like Poltergeist as well, because when you watch no one actually dies in Poltergeist. It's a movie with zero death, but it's got so much scares and so much, like, these are all great entry level horror movies. And I just don't think I can put Five Nights at Freddy's on like a par with any of those movies. I don't know, like, what do you think?
No, definitely not.
Okay. Just sort of moving on then. Boomer also says, I think it needed a bit of editing and a little bit of writing, then add gore and bam, good movie. Well, that's it. I think this fundamentally, right? I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with a lot of the things that happen in this movie. Ultimately, I think this is a really competently made movie. I think it's definitely aimed towards a younger audience, which is absolutely fine. I just don't think there's anything in there that I found particularly memorable.
Yeah.
When you talk about, again, going back to these movies that we've just mentioned, so let's talk about Hocus Pocus, right? It's got great cast. It's got memorable moments. Every single person in the world remembers Bette Midler singing I Put a Spell on You in the middle of that movie.
Yeah.
Every single person remembers the book with the eye, and it's got hooks. It's got things that make you remember it. And for me, I just don't think this movie has it. Again, I completely agree with you, Boomer. If it had a little bit better writing, a little bit better acting as well, because I have to say I wasn't thrilled with a lot of the performances we get in this movie.
Yeah.
And we'll you just woof.
I said it was.
It was it okay? We'll get on to who was definitely my favorite person in the movie in just a couple of minutes, and I think I probably speak for the entire horror fandom when I say that we are all happiest watching Five Nights at Freddy's when Matthew Lillard is on the screen. He is by far and away the most redeeming factor of this movie. Matthew Lillard, of course, absolute horror icon, known for things like Scream and 13 Ghosts, Scooby-Doo, and a whole host of other things. You know him from a couple of things from outside of horror as well. But Matthew Lillard is just like a darling of the horror world. So having him here was an absolute treat, and I'm sure that was the same for everyone who's a big fan of his. However, it was so telegraphed that Matthew Lillard was the twist. Sorry, spoilers for anyone who's not seen it, but Matthew Lillard is the big bad in this movie, and even though I probably missed about 20 minutes of this movie, I still woke up in the cinema, turned to you, and went, "He's the bad guy."
Yeah,
and I was right.
That's actually what happened.
So I think absolutely, I do believe, upon reading my research, I didn't know this going in. Apparently, it was ruined before the movie came out. Apparently, they'd accidentally released an image that revealed that Matthew Lillard was the bad guy. I didn't know that going in. It's not something that I'd seen around, but when I was reading up the trivia and things for this movie, it's something that I saw pop up. So for a lot of people, obviously, that had already been ruined. It wasn't ruined for me. I still managed to figure it out. There you go, Boomer said, you're right, it literally couldn't have been anyone else, unless it was a character that we had just completely not been introduced to at all by this point. But I think, I just feel like, and this is where the better writing, I think, could have came into this. I think just, if you have just, that little bit of better writing, you could be a little bit more creative. Doesn't mean you still didn't have to be your bad guy. You could have still been your bad guy, but I think the movie needed a couple more red herrings in there. It needed more people it could have been. It was just so linear. Like you say, it literally could not have been anyone else. If you had thrown even just a couple of throwaway characters in there, just something, because Matthew Lillard is not in this movie for very long, and up until, we sort of get into the main sort of act of the movie, Matthew Lillard only has a couple of minutes of screen time.
Yeah.
So you're not telling me you couldn't have done that also with another character. It doesn't have to be a big famous horror name, but just anyone that could have possibly taken the suspicion away from Matthew Lillard for a little bit. Because, it's not beyond horror icons and horror legends to appear in movies for less than a few minutes and not really have that big an impact on the movie and not be the big bad or the big savior or whatever. That's...
Yeah, because it was quickly clear that the babysitter's boyfriend or brother, whatever he was, and his friends were gonna die quite quickly in the movie.
Yeah.
And they obviously wouldn't be the bad guys, so it's just kind of easy to predict what will happen next, and
yeah, that's it. It was just so ultimately predictable. But Matthew Lillard being there is still definitely a plus point for the movie.
Yeah.
Because for me, again, and this is going back to something that I'm not sure if I've talked to you about, but it's definitely something that I've talked to Nico about, is that it seems to be something for me that's happening a lot more in the last few years than I've noticed, and it's something that I'm really not a fan of, is that there's really no characters to really like. And I feel like I've repeated this point on the podcast several times for other movies, but there's so many unlikable characters in this movie, and Rudy's just mentioned probably the worst one there, the aunt. She's awful, obviously, but the babysitter as well, is also awful. But I also don't find our two main characters of, the brother and sister. I don't find them particularly likable either,
Not
to
at
be
all.
honest. He's obviously got some serious anger issues. That, when he's punching that kid's dad in the shopping mall or whatever it is, But the little girl's not particularly there's. And again, that's maybe what makes me cling on to Matthew Lillard, and maybe what other people cling on to Matthew Lillard so much. It also maybe potentially just brings that sort of nostalgia factor.
I literally gasped and said, "Oh, look, it's Scooby-Doo."
Yeah, she said it. Oh, it's Scooby-Doo. It's not even fucking Scooby-Doo. He plays Shaggy.
Yeah.
So
same thing.
It's Scooby-Doo and Shaggy are not the same thing. I'll have people on Twitter absolutely hounding me for complaining that Scooby-Doo and Shaggy are not the same thing. I
don't remember what exactly I said.
Yeah.
I either said Scooby-Doo or look at Shaggy.
You definitely said Scooby-Doo.
Well, one or the other, so...
Okay. Even her performance was so over the top. That's the thing, the aunt was absolutely chewing the scene. It was really, really... I don't want to do a disservice like theater actors, but it felt like theater acting, you know, when people are really like acting for the back rows. And that wasn't just from the aunt, that was also from the brother and the sister as well, our main characters, and the policewoman Vanessa. Like, she was really bad. Like, I really disliked her performance greatly. I was not a fan of it at all. I really thought the acting in this movie, and I'm not wanting to like personally attack any of the people who were in this film, but I really had an issue with some of the choices, I think is probably the best way to put it, about, you know, how certain scenes played out and how certain act lines were said and things like that. I just felt like all around, apart from Matthew Lillard, because he actually seems to know what he's doing, it just felt so campy and corny all the way through. Listen, I guess if you're going for like a more kids themed style entry level horror movie, that's possibly the way that you want to go, right? You want to maybe go that little sort of camp. You don't want people to give you fucking Macbeth in the middle of Five Nights at Freddy's. At the end of the day, this is still a horror movie called Five Nights at Freddy's, based around animatronic dolls killing people in a pizzeria. So how serious do you want to get with it, you know? So I don't know, like there's but I feel like there's still a balance to be struck, and I just felt this went way too far over to the we're gonna take this really campy and corny and make it just ridiculous sort of routine, whilst also trying to maintain some of the seriousness of having these animatronics actually go out and kill you. And another thing for me is, again, I'm not overly familiar with the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's. I've played the first game. I've not really seriously played any of the others, so the lore is this is maybe something that could just be answered by people who are a fan of the series. But for me, obviously, in that initial game, the Freddy, not Freddy Fazbear, but all of our characters, Chica and Foxy and the other characters, all the animatronics, they're the big bads in those games. And in actual fact, here they're nothing more than just, for lack of a better word, puppets. They're just tools of Freddy Fazbear. So, you know, the whole franchise is sort of based around these characters. But in actual fact, all these characters are doing is the bidding of Matthew Lillard's character.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Again, it just all for me. It just makes it all feel confused, muddled, and just.
And another like big thing that confused me, and you even agreed with it, was, is that cupcake supposed to be another child?
Oh yeah, so obviously,
what's wrong with that?
Yeah, again, this is probably something that can be answered by people who are fans of the franchise. The cupcake, because we talked about it, didn't we? And obviously, every character has the soul. What was it? Of a child. Is the soul of a child that was killed or lured there. So what the fuck is the soul?
Because the child is still in
the body is still physically in. Yeah, the body's still physically in the animatronics. So what the fuck is in the cupcake? A smaller child? A baby? Is it a dog? Is it a pet? What the fuck is
My guess was a pet.
Your guess was a pet. I bet that's still pretty small. A sausage dog. No. A wee sausage dog. That's going to upset you.
Yeah.
Just a head. Just like decapitated head. Do you think like maybe like the cupcake?
Because it feels like it would be a dog, but because it listens to all the commands and everything.
Yeah, so. I just thought like again though, that's possibly us maybe just taking things a little bit too seriously when it comes to the film. Maybe I'm just not giving it, you know, enough credit, enough. I don't know, like. I kind of like, when we left the cinema, obviously I was particularly not very fan of this. We were talking about doing this episode, and then, you know, we were saying like I've not really got a huge amount of good things to say about it. I have kind of gone a little bit back and forth in my head, not to that I think it's a good movie, because I don't. It's not a movie that I'm in any kind of rush to go and rewatch. But maybe I'm being just a little bit too harsh, a little bit too critical. Maybe I'm missing the point of what it's supposed to be going for.
For me, as somebody that's not too much into horror yet, I don't know. I felt very similar to you about everything that was going on. So
apologies.
Even I almost fell asleep.
Yeah.
Not gonna lie.
Apologies to people watching us live. When there's such a big height difference between us, it's really difficult to get us both like in the frame at the same time. So, no, I mean, I think I'm going to go back and forth about whether or not I'm being a little overly critical of this for a while. I'm going to come down on what I believe and how I feel about the movie ultimately. A couple of things I want to mention, because I do remember at one point, I can't remember if I told you this or not, but I do remember at one point in the movie sort of thinking to myself, they're not, like, why don't they just, like, phone out or, you know, call for help and things like that. And I felt it was very dated at times as a film.
Yeah.
This film is set in the year 2000.
I think you actually mentioned it. Why don't they just, like,
yeah.
call for help?
But I didn't really realize it at the time. The movie is set in the year 2000, which probably goes a pretty long way to explaining the majority of that. I think ultimately though, I don't have too much more about the movie that I want to talk about, unless you obviously can have the floor, and if there's anyone who wants to bring something up in the chat, then feel free to do so. Ultimately, I think I have to give this some sort of credit. What this franchise has done, and I've noticed this like from a personal perspective as well, what this horror franchise has done, and I think it's the first horror franchise to really have done it and for a long, long time. Maybe not for sort of my age group, but when I look at my nephews and when I think about my nephews growing up, and my nephews are 10 and 12, and I remember over the past sort of 4, 5, 6 years them having Five Nights at Freddy. My pen's just gone the other side of the room again. I remember them having Five Nights at Freddy's figures. I remember them talking about Five Nights at Freddy's, and this is back when they were 7, 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
It is a franchise that has leaked into popular culture. It is leaked in, and it's also something because of, I think, the cute factor, you could possibly say, with some of our animatronics, because of the sort of cartoony factor that it has. It's something that I think the youth have really, really latched onto as a franchise, and you'll have all have seen it. Anyone who's on social media will have seen videos of people absolutely losing their fucking shit in the cinema over this movie and over some of the decisions that were made. And I think this franchise, unlike so many others, it absolutely has got its roots in the youth, and this is why I think this could potentially still go on to become one of our sort of the next big franchise. What are you laughing at?
Comment.
Oh, the boomer. I didn't consider that, but it really has. It's like this generation's Gremlins. Exactly. Everyone wanted a Mogwai when they grew up. Everyone wanted a Gizmo. They were so fucking cute, and this is, I think, I think you're absolutely spot on there. But making even more money, and because of the amount of money it's made, and again we'll get onto that briefly, because it's not even finished making money. It's still it's still in the theaters. It's still out there. It's still making money. I think this is a franchise, a movie franchise that's going to go on and become like the next big thing. So I have to give it credit for that, and I think that's ultimately how very much helped contribute to its success, unlike so many others. The only other horror franchise I can really think that sort of seeped into a generation the way it did is Resident Evil. And that was very much my generation. You're talking about Gremlins there for sort of people that were, being brought up in the 80s. I think Resident Evil for me as a 90s child was that sort of thing. I don't really remember there being much in the sort of noughties. That's more your age range. But again, you're not super into horror at that point. So you're maybe looking at your sort of Silent Hills, but that didn't really make the transfer to the big screen particularly well. And then for sort of 2010s and beyond generation, I think it's Five Nights at Freddy's. I think that's what this is going to do. So ultimately, you have to give it credit for being that sort of massive success that it's absolutely going to be.
I think, like, if they do make more movies and stuff, and if they make, like, next one way better than this one, it could be way more successful. But
it just
it depends on, like, how they choose to do it, and like, if they do put more effort, I would say, in.
I don't even think necessarily effort's the word I want to use. Like, they've obviously put effort and care into it. You know, again, like, there's been people saying, you know, how many Easter eggs and, you know, lore has been put into this movie. It's just that we don't know it. So I think the effort is there. I just think the execution of it was not great. I think if they make some smarter decisions, you know, we obviously know that Matthew Lillard's character is still alive at the end of the movie, so who knows, are we going to get yet another franchise where, you know, will we get the return of Matthew Lillard? I think everyone is sick to death of waiting for him to reappear in a Scream movie. You know, they've been doing that for the past 2 decades. Will he show up in Scream 7? Who knows? But you know, you were going to have to do with that again for him in Five Nights at Freddy's. I just think they needed to make smarter choices.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there anything else about the movie that you would like to talk about? Any other aspects, points? Again, if you want to talk about anything else in the chat, feel free to pop a thought or opinion in there. Boomer says, horror has done really well in the cinema this year. I thought this was going to flop, shows what I know. I don't think there was ever a point where I thought this was going to flop. I think because I already knew about how this had sort of infiltrated the younger generation, I didn't think there was ever going to be a point where this movie was going to be a flop financially. Personally, on a personal level, in terms of my enjoyment, I think it's a flop from that perspective. But I think financially, it's obviously not been a flop.
I thought that it kind of would flop as well, because at my work I have a few people that are as well into like horror gaming, or horror movies, both. And before I went to see this movie, I kind of mentioned, planning to go see it. And I was kind of like, at first I was kind of excited, just to like go see it.
Yeah.
And got asked, do you think it's gonna actually be good? So I was like, well, I'm not really sure. I've not really played any of the games or anything. And then afterwards, I was speaking to another co-worker, and he was mentioning that he's not heard good things about it at all. So
it's
there's gonna be like a lot of people saying it's been really bad. So
it's a divisive one. It's definitely going to be a divisive one. I think it's one of those rare occasions for me, because normally I try to not get hyped up for movies that I'm going to go see. I try not to find out too much about them. Obviously, there are exceptions to those rules. You know, Saw 10 coming out, I've discussed it on these streams before and in previous episodes. You know, I was super fucking hyped for that going into, and I think that did really well, and that has ultimately been very, very well received. Boomer, I know you're not the biggest fan of that franchise, but it's been generally pretty well received, and it's done all right at the box office and things like that. You know, I try to have low expectations. We mentioned that franchise. I'm not the hugest Scream fan in the world. That's no secret on this podcast. So I try to have low expectations going in. Five Nights at Freddy's is one of those few movies where I literally had no expectations going in. Number one, because I barely played any of the actual game franchise. And number two, just because I purely didn't know what to expect. And in actual fact, I think that's turned out to be a detriment to me enjoying this film. It's one of those occasions that I think, had I gone into this with at least a sort of more rudimentary knowledge of some of the lore, some of the games, the franchise in general, I probably would have had a better time with this, rather than, you know, what usually makes you have a better time and is going in with as little expectations as possible.
I mean, I kind of went in without any expectations either, but it just didn't work for me.
No, it's fine. What else has Boomer got to say there? I agree, but they released it on Peacock at the same time. I think it's safe to say people do hate Peacock. I don't know if you're overly familiar with Peacock streaming service, but it is not a popular one. But again, potentially contributing to its success. You know, it's getting that dual sort of theater / streaming video on demand release. You're not a big fan of the Saw franchise, but you will say it's the best one probably since the second one. So even people who aren't fans of the Saw franchise are still saying Saw 10 is probably one of the better ones. Anyways, with that being said then, shall we move on?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, let's talk about some trivia. We'll start off with the finances of this movie, because I've alluded to it throughout this episode. So this movie had a budget, according to IMDb, of $20 million, which is a pretty sizable budget. This is a Blumhouse picture, so Blumhouse, I think over the past few years have really, obviously a very, very big sort of horror studio nowadays, but they've really been sort of pumping and backing the movies that come out. This movie's to date has grossed worldwide, again, according to IMDb, $218 million. So it's already 10 times its budget earned, and it's still in the theaters, it's still streaming on demand. I would expect it to go on to make possibly another 100 to 200 million. I could easily see that doubling in total. That is like a absolutely massive financial success that even as someone who always suspected that this movie would be really that would really do well, I don't think I would have ever expected to do that well.
Yeah.
It's probably
definitely not.
No, and I'll go into a couple other bits of trivia because it's absolutely blown pretty much everything else this year out of the water in terms of the financial success that it's been. Again, Boomer in the chat, Blumhouse is killing it this year financially, not necessarily with quality of films. Yeah, but like that's it again. It's making money and it's bringing horror to that mainstream. Is it better to bring maybe slightly lower quality horror movies to in order to get horror to the mainstream? Is that a trade that's worth it? So that horror could be a franchise, a genre, sorry, that is taken more seriously, that more people are willing to put money into. It's a trade-off. I think sometimes we need to sort of figure out where, again, that sort of sweet spot lies. Even before this movie was released, Jason Blum, who obviously runs Blumhouse, the production company, said that it had already made its budget back from selling the streaming and theatrical distribution rights. So even before this movie was released, they'd already broken even, and that's something that I don't think a lot of horror movies can ever really claim to have achieved. So that's a massive achievement. Boomer also says he thinks that is a sacrifice that's maybe worth it. Other financial successes are why Evil Dead was released for theaters. Exactly, we actually just watched Evil Dead Rise again yesterday. Yeah. It was the first time I'd watched it again since the cinema, I think. Yeah, so I think those movies are incredible. So again, yeah, absolutely, it's one of those things, isn't it? You have to find that sort of balance. This is Blumhouse's first ever video game adaptation. Maybe that can be put down as a slight excuse for why some of the decisions maybe aren't great. As everyone knows, what goes well in a video game might not necessarily go well in a film, same as going from novels to films and films to novels and vice versa. Maybe it was just naivety and they made, a few poor decisions. I don't know. This movie grossed $80 million domestically in its opening weekend, which is more than any other Blumhouse film ever. It surpassed 2018 Halloween, that upset me greatly, which had $76 million. It's also the second biggest opening weekend gross for any film based on a video game. The only one that beat it was the Super Mario Brothers movie that came out earlier this year as well, which still absolutely destroyed it. That had 146 million. So literally that's like one of your huge blockbusters. That's one of your highest grossing movies of all time it's going up against. And that's the only thing that's beating this in that category. That's incredible. Yeah. So, horror and video game horror and things like that are really starting to come to the mainstream. And it could be a very, very exciting time for the genre in the next couple of years. I think the only concern would be for me, and I think it's something that has been raised across sort of the horror community in times, is we just need to be careful that we don't go too far into the realm of, well, let's just make everything absolute money-making machines, because then that's when I think we possibly would start to see the end of this sort of golden age of horror that we've currently been going through.
Yeah.
A few other bits of trivia to go in there. As I said earlier, in the movie there's an alarming absence of any cell phone, tablet and internet. Something understandable taking into account that the movie is set in the spring of the year 2000. There's a moment early in the movie where we see some CCTV footage and it tells you it's the year 2000 in the top corner. That's the only part that I actually noticed that it was that year. I didn't notice it at the time, to be honest with you. It wasn't until I read about it later that that I found that out. Like in the video games, again, here's a little bit like sort of some of the Easter eggs that you would get. Foxy can be heard humming before he attacks. There's a couple of scenes where you see him going down the corridors and he's humming. He hums like that in the video games. He's the only character that has a voice, whereas the rest just lip sync to predetermined tunes programmed for the show. Because of Foxy's skeletal-like structure, he was built as a full-body animatronic puppet and performed by Russ Walco. All of the animatronics and puppets were created and designed by Jim Henson's Creature Shop. If you're unfamiliar with them, they're the people who made the Muppets. So it's a Muppet movie essentially. You know, we've got fucking. Why don't we just get Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy out there? And you know, I might have made it a more entertaining movie, to be honest with you, if there was you know, some Waldorf and Statler making really shit jokes from like, you know, the back of the theater. So it was all done by Jim Henson though. So that's cool. I think that's a really cool little tidbit. When Aunt Jane is watching the TV, the living room setup is exactly the same as one from one of the games, Five Nights at Freddy's sister location that came out in 2016. So again, referencing back to the video games, something that I think if you'd played the games, would have been a really fun moment for you. You know, I remember watching Welcome to Raccoon City and having real fun noticing things that was like, oh, that's in the video game. That's really cool. Like, and knowing that there's also something that is, to be said, generally satisfying about spotting something or knowing something that you know is there for the 1%.
Yeah.
That 90% of the audience isn't gonna get. There's something quite satisfying about that as well. It's maybe just not as satisfying when you're in the 90% and you're not getting it. So maybe there's something to be said like that. There's a scene in the classroom where there's words written on the chalkboard behind that says Puppet Bear, Bunny, and Fox and Chick. So they're again referencing the sort of the evils in the game. And before William Afton reveals his face, that's Matthew Lillard's character, he wipes his knife on his costume in the exact same way as he did when he played Ghostface in the Scream franchise, which is obviously a clear hint at his identity. And I just think that itself is a really cool fucking little tidbit. That's definitely one for the horror community that I really, really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Have you read anything since watching it about this movie? Anything you are aware of? I know what the answer is.
No.
No, nothing. Okay, I think that's enough trivia. So with that being said, we'll go on to our final segment of the show, which is the ratings and the reviews. As always, we will start off with the critics' scores. We'll go right the way through them because obviously you can see what all the scores are on my screen. So we won't do our regular sort of guessing game. IMDb have this. This I think is really fucking interesting actually. IMDb have this movie rated as a 5.5 out of 10. Metacritic have it rated at a 3.3. The Rotten Tomatoes critics have it at just 29%. But the Rotten Tomatoes audience have it at a massive 88%. So there's a huge discourse there between the critics and the audience there. Something that, you know, I think is possibly one of the larger ones we've seen for a while on this show. Critics' consensus is loaded with Easter eggs. Five Nights at Freddy's may be fun to watch for fans of the game, but most viewers of any other persuasion will find this adaptation muddled and decidedly unscary, whereas the audience says perfectly capturing the lore and the spirit of the source material, Five Nights at Freddy's is a long-awaited treat for fans of the game. I have to say, to be honest with you, I actually think both of those analogies are pretty spot on. They're just coming at it from different sides. So the critics are coming at it from, if you haven't seen this, you're not going to like it. The audience are coming from it, this is fucking ace because we've seen this. So I actually think they're both pretty spot on with their judgment. I just happen to come down on the critic side more than the audience side. Rudy says it's the Mario movie all over again. It was made for fans. I think there's maybe a slight difference in there. You know, we're talking about infiltrating sort of becoming into pop culture as well. Mario is something that has been into pop culture for the longest fucking time. That's transcended more than one generation. That's transcended more than 2 or 3 generations of sort of video game and movie lovers. So I think I get the point, but I think maybe there's just something everyone knows. You'd be hard pressed surely to find people who aren't aware of a couple of little things about Super Mario or Luigi or, you know, anything else, surely. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Those teenies are a powerful lot, says Boomer. Absolutely. As always, we throw it out to you guys, our listeners and our viewers, asking for your scores and opinions on the movie. We'll read out just a few of them. So Boomer, who's in the chat from Podcast in the Woods, gave it a 5 out of 10. It had some decent events, puppet effects, decent acting, and of course Matthew Lillard, but for every good there was a negative. Plodding story, terrible mystery element, and bloated runtime. It did just enough to be enjoyable, but nothing more. Hey, it is you, Boomer. Jazzmanian Demon gives it a 5 out of 10. I've been a Five Nights at Freddy's fan since the beginning, and I love the animatronics. Matthew Lillard is always a treat. The Matt Pat cameo was fun, but the story, the fort, and the little kid's self-insert really made it feel like a Disney Channel TV movie. Definitely feeling those vibes. Sarah Marie says a 7 out of 10. It could have been better. A round of applause for the Jim Creature Lab who made all the puppet suits and animatronics. They were stunning. I was so impressed with them. I was surprised there weren't as much jump scares I thought would happen. Storyline had a good tie-in. So yeah, maybe again someone else who liked things overall but still felt, you know, it wasn't scary enough. A friend of the show, Wren, 4 out of 10. Waited too long for animatronic mayhem that didn't pay off. A semi-decent gateway horror for the young kids that are obsessed with the game, which is pretty much what we've spent the last almost hour saying. I'd rather just watch Willy's Wonderland for the same plot and all of the fun stuff this lacked.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree. I could not agree with him more. Stew World Order gives it a 3.5. It was rough, too long, not scary, not funny, not really anything but boring. And I always say on this podcast, the worst thing a horror movie can be is boring. So I'd rather a movie was just flat out bad. And finally, D-Star6 says a 6, question mark. I think it's overhated by critics, but find the fan base's enthusiasm to be a little much. Maybe going back to what we were saying about people's reactions in the cinemas. It's genuinely funny. It might be one of the new best intros to horror for a younger audience. There is clear room for improvement though, and I want them to release the 4-hour cut. Please, no. I do not want to sit and watch this movie for 4 hours. But there's definitely not. No, there's a good range though there of opinions. You know, we've got scores coming there from a 3 all the way up to sort of 7s and things. So there's definitely a range of opinions. Anyways, overall, given everyone, we obviously calculate all the scores that you guys give us. On average, you guys scored this movie a 5.9 out of 10. So that's pretty much in that sort of middle range as well. With that being said, Anna, that just leaves me and you. So on a scale of 0 to 10, what would you rate Five Nights at Freddy's?
I think it would be a 3.
A 3? That's low. That's lower than I thought you'd go. Why so low?
Because I would definitely rather watch Willy's Wonderland. 100%.
Oh, I mean, that's absolutely fine. We haven't covered Willy's Wonderland on the show. That's maybe something that we could do in the relatively not too far future. I thought you'd maybe be a little higher on that.
No.
No? Okay, fair enough. Well, something shocking's about to happen because I'm going to give it more than that. I genuinely thought I was going to give it a far lower score than you are. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. Again, listen, I don't think this movie's for me. I agree with you completely. Willy's Wonderland did it much better. But you know, there is things in there. You know, you've got Matthew Lillard, which is always, you know, he's worth about 3 points just by himself. You know, I think you take into the fact, you know, this has been a huge success, and you know, it is that maybe that gateway horror movie. It maybe is just a case that, you know, it just isn't for us. So you know, that's why I'm gonna give it a 4. Anyways, all of our scores combined with the critics and the audience scores gives Five Nights at Freddy's an average score of 4.8 out of 10, and it means it is in 80th place of the now 88 movies we have covered on the show. So it is right down at the bottom. I'd have to admit.
I did expect it to be quite low.
Well, given how high the audience was on it, I thought it would maybe go a bit higher. But it's way down there in 80th place.
To be honest, I actually thought it would be way lower, but...
You thought what? You thought it was going to be down like bottom 5? You thought it was going to be like Winnie the Pooh territory? Exactly. Not that low. Not that low.
Maybe not that low, but...
Okay. Well, it puts it one place above Innocent Blood and one place below Zombievers. So I don't think you've seen either of those. No, I don't think you want to see either of those.
Probably not.
Probably not. For the intro to a brand new franchise, and a franchise that we think potentially is going to take off, that's a pretty shitty score. But that's where it is. So yeah, 80th place. There you go. Well, that is going to do it for this week's show. As I said, maybe not the longest episode we'll ever do in the world, but we just sort of wanted to ease ourselves back into it with something that we'd just seen, something that was new and fresh for all of you guys as well.
While we still remembered it.
While we still remember it as well, because I genuinely have no plans on going to see it ever again. Up next on the show, we will have returning special guest Candy. She's returning to the podcast. We've been trying to get her on the podcast for weeks and weeks and weeks now. Bless you. But she, unfortunately, due to work commitments and illnesses and things, we've been unable to do it. But Candy's going to come on the show next week, and we're going to be talking all about the 80s classic Maniac. So I'm very, very excited to talk about that with her as well. Until then, Anna, thank you very much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
Yes.
Always happy to be here.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone for downloading this episode. Thank you to everyone for tuning in live as well. We really appreciate you guys. And thank you to everyone who's hung out with us in the chat room today and given us your opinions. Boomer, as always, Rudy as well. Thank you so much to you guys for joining us. We really appreciate you. And until next week on the Pod of the Damned, just remember, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.